being here. Crisis in Libya. I'd like to thank our witnesses for again appearing before the committee on this important issue. Unfortunately, 6 years ago, after intervention, Libya remains on the brink of civil war. Like many of its neighbors, Libya failed to transition into a stable, representative democracy hoped for by its citizens following the Arab Spring. And sadly, it's the Libyan people who have paid the price. Fighting between militias has undermined internal security, weakened government institutions, and damaged the economy. It is also posing substantial risk to the U.S. and to our allies. Infighting has created a permissive environment for terrorist groups like ISIS. The organization's gains in Libya have led to U.S.-supported military operations last year in places like Sirte. We've had some successes there, but the conditions allowing extremists to thrive remain. I think many of us agree that the Libyan political agreement needs to be altered, as the current government lacks the power to actually govern the entire country. But that's only the array of militias come under some type of central political control. No government will be able to provide essential services across the country. And even then, Libya will still face enormous challenges to fix weak government institutions and turn around a struggling economy. I look forward to our discussion today and hearing from our two witnesses on the views of the crisis and what needs to be done to bring about its peaceful resolution. We'll be particularly interested to hear your views on what the U.S. should do to help achieve these goals. And with that, and what we should expect if ISIS or other radical groups regain ground in Libya. Again, we thank you both for being here. Ambassador, I didn't want you to have to hear all of my opening statements, so I went ahead and began. And with that, I'll turn it over to our distinguished ranking member, Senator Cardin.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thought your opening statement was very important to be heard by all, so I just want you to know that, and I thank you very much for convening this hearing on Libya. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to represent this committee along with Senator Graham, who was representing the Appropriations Committee, and we met with the ambassadors to the United Nations Security Council. And we had about a 2-hour discussion, and I thought it was a very helpful discussion. And we talked about a whole range of issues, from North Korea to reform within the United Nations. And Ambassador Haley is doing an incredible job of representing our interests, and I think her leadership as now the President of the Security Council for this month will be important. She's focusing on the issues of reform. She's focusing on the issues of North Korea and other areas that the United States has national security interests. But one of the issues that came up during that discussion by our friends in Europe and our friends in Africa and the Middle East is what will be America's engagement. Will America be a power for the values that we stand for in dealing with global challenges? And that was raised by both friends in Europe and the Middle East and Africa. And I say that because I start with the fact that the United States must be engaged. It's in our national security interest to have representative governments in countries like Libya that represent all of the population. Because when we don't have representative governments, what happens is it creates a void. And that void is filled by ISIS, as we've seen in northern Africa. It's filled by Russia's engagement in Libya, which has not been helpful. And we recognize that it's in America's national to get engaged. So, as you know, we have a private panel of witnesses. The Trump administration has yet to be able to fill its critical positions, and we're still not exactly clear what his policies are in regards to Libya. I was disappointed, Mr. Chairman, in the meeting with the Prime Minister of Italy that President Trump said there's, I don't paraphrase it, but that we don't really have a role in Libya. I think we do have a role in Libya, and I think this hearing is an important indication by the Congress that we do expect a role to be played. I want to just underscore the importance of a representative, inclusive government. And there's no military solution. We've seen this all too frequently in so many countries in that region. There's really no military solution. We need an inclusive government, a government that represents all of the different factions. We saw, as the chairman pointed out, the leadership of GNA, we were able to make progress in CERT. That was important. But we also see with Moscow's involvement, Mr. Putin's involvement, that General Haftar in the eastern part of Libya is causing all types of problems for civilian control of the country, and is also participating in activities that, in my mind, raise to concern about human rights violations and war crimes. So if it's done right, we not only can have a representative government, the management of their oil resources can inure to the benefit of the people of Libya and give them a growing economy and a growing standard of living. That is our goal, and I think this hearing can play an important part in the Senate's oversight from our two witnesses.
Well, thank you very much for those comments, and we'll now turn to our witnesses. The first witness is Dr. Fred Wayre, Endowment for International Peace. Thank you so much for being here, sir. Our second witness is Honorable Deborah Jones, U.S. Ambassador to Libya from 2013 to 2015. Thank you for bringing your expertise and knowledge. And if you just give your opening comments in the order I just introduced you, if you could summarize in about 5 minutes, we'd appreciate it. Without objection, your written testimony will be entered into the record. You've been here many times, so please proceed.
Thank you. Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Cardin, committee members, I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak with you here today about Libya's political crisis and the way forward for U.S. policy. I'm also honored to be joined by my distinguished co-panelist. For those of us who have followed Libya since the revolution, its unraveling has been harrowing to watch. Today, the UN-backed Presidency Council in Tripoli is failing in basic governance, unable to establish itself amidst feuding militias and internal paralysis. More importantly, the Council confronts an existential challenge from an eastern faction led by General Khalifa Haftar, backed by Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and increasingly Russia. The Haftar in the East has refused to endorse the Presidency Council, with its key objection being the issue of control over Libya's military. Meanwhile, the country's surge of migrants across Libya's deserts and shores remains unchecked, and jihadist militancy, whether in the form of the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, or some new mutation, could still take root. These looming dangers, Mr. Chairman, demand immediate engagement from the United States. At the most basic level, the United States faces two imperatives. First, preventing a resurgence of terrorist activity, and second, supporting the formation of an inclusive, representative, stable government. On the counterterrorism front, the Libyan-led campaign in CERT last summer and fall deprived the Islamic State of any real territory. The remaining Islamic State militants, estimated in the low hundreds, are currently pooling in the center, west, and south, and they may try to mount a high-visibility attack to show their continued viability. What struck me the most during my visits last year to Libyan areas afflicted by a jihadist presence, whether Sirte, Benghazi, or the West, is that any traction the Islamic State got was often highly transactional. It was the result of poor governance. And this points to the importance of a broad-based approach in denying the jihadist sanctuary. Here, non-military strategies are essential. Promoting economic development, municipal governance, education, and civil society form a vital adjunct to counterterrorism tools. In the effort to identify and assist local Libyan partners to defeat terrorism, the United States must proceed carefully. Given the absence of a truly national, cohesive military, American aid to a particular armed group could upset the balance of power and cause greater factional conflict. Moving forward, the United States should only back those forces controlled by the internationally recognized government. And even this support should be limited in scope and geared towards specific threats. The second area where American diplomatic engagement is crucial is the formation of a new government. A starting point for doing this is a new Libyan-led dialogue backed by the United States with European partners and regional states. And the goal of the talks should be the amendment of the Libyan Political Agreement of 2015, specifically the composition of the Presidency Council. The new talks should also focus on two tracks absent in the first agreement. First, they should include the leaders of Libya's armed groups, who must agree on a roadmap for building a national-level military structure. Here, an American red line must continue to be the elected civilian control over the military. Proposals for military rule or a military council are hardly a recipe for enduring stability. And for most Libyans, they run counter to the values for which they fought in the 2011 revolution. Second, the talks must also set up a mechanism for the transparent distribution of oil revenues, especially to municipal authorities. Once such an agreement is in place, the United States and its allies must stand ready to assist whatever government emerges, and not just on counterterrorism. With its formal institutions gutted by years of dictatorial rule, Libya's citizens remain its greatest resource. And this is why it's so important that the United States preserve its capacity to engage directly with the Libyan people. Mr. Chairman, committee members, my travels across Libya during the past years have underscored the desperation of its plight. Yes, the Islamic State was dealt a significant blow, thanks in large measure to the sacrifices of brave Libyans. But Libya is now more polarized than ever, and the growing vacuum could breed future radicalism. Now is the time for American leadership to avert an impending collapse, safeguard American interests, and to help the country realize the early promise of its revolution. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you here today.
Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Senator Cardin, distinguished members of the committee. First, my apologies. As a retiree, I've never dealt with the parking downtown coming in from McLean before on a Tuesday morning. But it is my distinct honor to appear before you today on this important and vexing matter, and I am pleased to appear with a colleague that I consider a real authority and one of the most honest authorities or the most honest voices on Libya today that I hear. Libya obviously has confounded and frustrated and exhausted policymakers and diplomatic practitioners alike with its stubborn resistance to the obvious political math of 1.2 million barrels of oil a day and a mere 6 million citizens. Caught up in the endorphins of revolution, many assumed that Libya, like Athena from the head of Zeus, would turn into Dubai on the Mediterranean, and that we could all go away. In hindsight, clearly it was wistful thinking, because Libya was not, the landscape was not a tabula rasa. Libya has a history like any other place, and that history is one of fragmentation, even preceding Gaddafi. What I've often said to people is that Gaddafi was not the creator of Libya's fragmentation. He certainly exploited it using the oil wealth that he had at his disposal. And I think it's important to remember that he deposed King Idris without firing a shot. When he came in, he used that oil wealth much as a cartel warlord would do, to extort, to bribe, to bring into power actually very disparate parts of the country. Libya has always existed, as Julius Caesar said, like Gaul. It's three separate entities, Tripolitania, Cyrenaica, Fezzan, with different historical and political backgrounds, and which explain to us often the different influences at play to this day in each of those regions from international partners. When Gaddafi died, in effect, Libya was a mafia without a don. And that is the challenge that we have now. Gaddafi was gone, but his legacy remained. Understanding this backdrop is very important to comprehending the deep divides and political antagonisms that followed the revolution, which I concluded not long after my arrival in Tripoli in 2013 was for all intents and purposes unfinished. There had been highly touted parliamentary vote in 2012, in July 2012, but essentially that's the equivalent of purchasing a nib for a fountain pen that doesn't exist. There was no government behind it, and there still remains no effective government behind that. I don't want to repeat a lot of what's said here. I've submitted a rather lengthy background notes, which I hope people will read, because it contains a bit of a different narrative. Many people have described the splits in Libya as somehow secular nationalist versus Islamist, others, myself included, and I suspect that Dr. Wehry would agree, viewed the situation more in terms of status quo anti-elements, some who were pro-Gaddafi, versus democratic revolutionary elements, some Islamist, with ideological extremists on both sides. The revolution revealed, together with true patriots, a significant significant number of whom were educated in the United States and elsewhere in the West, some unabashed ideologues, a number of, as Dr. Wary has said, opportunistic bedfellows whose political promiscuity for material gain often blurred extinctions. I won't go into the whole narrative of the talks and the long talks there, but I would agree with Fred, and as we've looked over it, that over time, as we were there observing on the ground and working to advance our mutual interests, that it soon became very clear to us that when we were dealing with areas that did not affect the national patrimony or the appearance of giving advantage to either military side, we were able to accomplish things. On the other, efforts to train elite special forces and then to respond to then Prime Minister Ali Zaidan's April 2013 appeal to G7 leaders to help him build a general purpose force, that competition, that fractiousness, and the lack of any unified command and control system. Interestingly, throughout, the Gaddafi-era technocrats who were entrusted with the central bank, with the National Oil Company, and with the Libyan Investment Authority were left largely alone to do their business, indicating to me that Libyans, in fact, did not want to disturb their wealth, their national wealth. And in fact, we found that we worked pretty closely behind the scenes with them to ensure that that remained the case. Now, unfortunately, in the latter years and following the negotiations, as the competition has become more fierce, there have been efforts by some to create competing authorities to the dismay, I would say, of the average Libyan, whose primary concern is that he or she have enough to eat, to communicate, and ideally to travel. I would only say that, and against this background of Tripoli's political disarray, which was significant, Benghazi continued to suffer a spate of brazen assassinations and lawlessness. The government had, for all intents and purposes, removed itself from Benghazi with the international community. And this is when Khalifa Haftar first appeared at the time in February 2014, at the time of the dissolution, basically, or the agreed dissolution of the GNC, or that it would be, and went on a television, what we always called an electron coup, calling on Libyans to rise up and join him against the illegal, unlawful GNC and corrupt. He did not stir much response in that effect. He went back underground, only reappearing in May in Benina, in Benghazi, when he declared his basically vigilante war against individuals he constituted responsible for, or he condemned as responsible for Benghazi's anarchy, blood-soaked anarchy. Together with this, we had, again, you know the story, the narrative of the national elections that were held in 2014. I hope you will read carefully my paragraph on that, because my narrative, my understanding, and I was on the ground, was a bit different. In response to counter threats and threats of Haftar moving into Libya, or into Tripoli, and the declaration by this time of the people on the Tobruk side that the dialogue was no longer necessary, the Misratan militias acted preemptively and, of course, encircled to drive the Zintan militias out of Tripoli, which meant taking them out of areas that they had conquered during the revolution. This was a lot, again and again and again, about booty, about revolutionary booty, people holding on to assets, whether it be the airport, the Tripoli tower that held the Libyan Investment Authority, the Islamic call center that was an important center under Gaddafi, and later on as in terms of territory. This was why this fighting over this Zintan-occupied territory that others felt they had no right to is what led to our withdrawal and led to eventual withdrawal of all diplomatic members or diplomatic institutions or missions in Libya at the time. I won't get into the boycott. I will offer a couple of things against this chaotic background. Despite the political disarray, the United States, during my tenure as Chief of Mission, did conduct a number of missions successfully, to include the capture of both Anas al-Libi and Benghazi suspect Abu Khatallah, while engaging credibly with all sides in the political reconciliation talks and with the support of successive Libyan governments. In other words, This is not a matter of requires us to pick and choose. Libyans were the first to assert the presence of ISIL and Daesh in Derna and to seek U.S. assistance in removing them. The Mizrahans were the first to draw our attention to the growing ISIL presence in Sirte, a presence reportedly accommodated by members of the Gaddafi Dam tribe, who were historical enemies of the Mizrahans, who earlier had affiliated for similarly opportunistic reasons with Ansar Sharia, another terrorist group. We can talk about ISIL later, but I think you've covered the roadmap there. Let me just say in conclusion, and we can get into questions later, that Libya is not engaged in a traditional civil war based on intractable ideological difference. This is a war of attrition aimed at controlling, not destroying, critical infrastructure in the absence of a trusted administrator of national wealth. Historically, exhaustion, impoverishment, or physical hurt have proven the prime motivators for arriving at negotiated solutions. But as long as different factions, who thus far have been fairly evenly matched in terms of holding their turf, continue to believe they can count on external support to tip the scales and avoid reaching the limits of that impoverishment, hurt, or exhaustion, intermittent low-intensity warfare will continue, contributing to human suffering, refugee flows, and penetration of Libya's vast territory by foreign fighters, al-Qaeda, and ISIL and Daesh. This is good neither for Libya, nor for us, nor for our European partners. But any Libyan solution will require buy-in at the lowest levels, at the municipal levels, for a governing regime that ensures the equitable distribution of national wealth, in this case oil revenues, a certain degree of autonomy, including on security matters at local and regional levels, and the reintegration of militias and the rehabilitation of their members. It must be inclusive and allow for the return and rehabilitation of all Libyans, no matter who they supported in the revolution. It must begin with a ceasefire, monitored by the international community with Libyan acquiescence and support, as well as the gathering of heavy weapons throughout the country and continued cooperation in the war against ISIL, Daesh, and others wishing to exploit Libyan territory. Libyans must agree to all of this, and I would note here that no one party controls.
Come to a conclusion here.
Okay, I will conclude. Otherwise, let me just say, civil conflict, Libya's not easy, but it's a worthwhile project. There's no alternative. Legitimacy cannot be imposed, it must be earned. Libyans have not asked us to fight their battles for them. The least we can do is support their dreams, which were inspired, frankly, by our example. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Senator Cardin.
Well, let me thank both of our witnesses. There's clearly great differences between Syria and Libya. Syria has ethnic clashes that are very deep and historic, whereas Libya does not have that burden. But we saw where Russia intervened in Syria